In early February of the year 1972, Iran experienced one of the deadliest blizzards in recorded history. It was a disaster that no one saw coming. And when the snow started falling, no one expected it to last as long as it did. For nearly a week, the storm raged on, covering entire regions of the country in thick layers of snow. By the time it was over, more than 4,000 lives had been lost, and entire villages had been wiped off the map. This devastating blizzard hit after 4 years of drought, a period when Iran had been struggling with dry conditions and failing crops. People had grown used to mild winters, so when the snow began to fall, there was little concern at first, but this was no ordinary snowfall. The storm system brought relentless blizzards that buried parts of northwestern, central, and southern Iran under more than 25 feet of snow. Entire communities disappeared overnight, their homes and streets swallowed by towering snowdrifts. The hardest hit areas included villages in southern and western Iran, where many people lived in rural communities that were ill-equipped for extreme winter weather. The village of Shaklabad, near the border with Turkey, was one of many that suffered a terrible fate. Over 100 people lived there, but when rescue workers eventually arrived, they found no survivors. It was as if the village had never existed, buried beneath the crushing weight of snow and ice. At first, people assumed the storm would pass quickly, but as the days went on, conditions only worsened. Temperatures dropped to extreme lows, reaching negative 25 degrees Celsius. Roads were quickly buried, cutting off access to entire regions and leaving thousands of people stranded. With no way to bring in food or medical supplies, many people were left to face the storm on their own. Those who ran out of firewood and fuel had no way to stay warm. Homes became ice-cold traps, and for many, survival was impossible. In some areas, avalanches swept down mountain slopes, destroying anything in their path. The Shalu Road, a key route through the mountains, was completely buried, stranding hundreds of travelers. Power lines snapped under the weight of the snow, leaving entire towns in darkness. With communication lines down, it was nearly impossible for authorities to understand the full scale of the disaster. The Iranian government struggled to respond, and rescue efforts were slow to get underway. As the storm continued, fear and desperation spread. People trapped in their homes had no way of knowing if help would come. Some attempted to dig their way out, but with snowdrifts reaching the roofs of buildings, it was nearly impossible. Others huddled together, burning whatever they could find to keep warm. But as supplies ran out and the temperatures remained dangerously low, the situation became more and more dire. The Iran blizzard of 1972 was not just a storm, it was a catastrophe unlike anything the country had seen before. And as the days passed, the death toll continued to rise. As the blizzard raged on, Iran's remote villages and towns found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. Heavy snowfall had blocked every major road, making travel impossible. Trains stopped running, buses were stranded, and even military vehicles could not push through the towering drifts. In some places, the snow was so deep that it buried entire houses, leaving only rooftops visible. People trapped inside had no way to escape and no way to call for help. The lack of communication made the situation even worse. Telephone lines had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, cutting off entire regions from government aid. In rural areas, where radios were scarce, families had no idea how widespread the disaster was, or when rescue teams might arrive. Villagers who attempted to reach nearby towns quickly realized that the deep snow made travel impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, succumbing to the brutal cold and exhaustion. One of the most tragic aspects of the blizzard was its impact on those already struggling with illness. A flu outbreak had been spreading through rural Iran in the weeks before the storm. Once the blizzard hit, medical supplies became nearly impossible to deliver. Those who had fallen ill before the storm found themselves completely cut off from doctors or hospitals. With temperatures plunging to negative 25 degrees Celsius, even the healthiest individuals were at risk of hypothermia and frostbite. In the province of Azerbaijan, the snowfall was so extreme that it completely buried at least 200 villages. One of the hardest hit areas was the village of Sheklab, home to around 100 residents. When rescue teams finally reached the village days later, they discovered a grim reality: no one had survived. The entire community had been wiped out, frozen beneath layers of ice and snow. Throughout the affected regions, the weight of the snow caused buildings to collapse. In cities like Hamadan and Tabriz, people became trapped inside their homes as walls and roofs gave way. Those fortunate enough to still have access to food and heat rationed their supplies carefully, unsure of how long the storm would last. Schools, businesses, and government offices shut down, and entire cities came to a standstill. Despite the chaos, there were incredible acts of bravery. Some individuals risked their lives to help others, digging through the snow in search of survivors or delivering supplies to neighbors in need. Rescue workers struggled against the extreme conditions, using helicopters to drop food and medical aid to areas that could not be reached by land. However, with visibility near zero and wind speeds making flying dangerous, even these efforts were often unsuccessful. The blizzard was relentless, showing no signs of letting up. As more and more communities were buried under the snow, the death toll continued to climb. For those still trapped, the only hope was that the storm would finally pass before it was too late. As the days passed, the situation across Iran became even more desperate. The sheer scale of the blizzard left authorities overwhelmed, and with roads buried under towering snowdrifts, the government struggled to coordinate rescue and relief efforts. Entire regions remained cut off, and reports of worsening conditions trickled in from the few areas that still had working communication. In the mountainous areas of western Iran, avalanches became a new and deadly threat. As the weight of the snow pressed down on unstable slopes, massive walls of ice and debris crashed down onto villages and roadways. In some cases, entire communities were wiped out in seconds, buried under tons of snow, before they even had a chance to react. The Shalu Road, a critical passage through the mountains, was completely blocked, stranding travelers with no way forward or back. In the province of Gilan, the situation was equally dire. Villages along the Caspian Sea coast were buried under layers of snow that had never been seen before in the region's history. The storm had arrived so suddenly that many people were caught outside when temperatures plummeted. Those who were unable to find shelter quickly froze to death. The relentless wind made it nearly impossible to see, turning simple movements into life-threatening challenges. With food supplies dwindling, many families were left with impossible choices. Some attempted to dig tunnels through the snow to neighboring homes in search of food or firewood, only to become disoriented and lost. Others burned whatever they could find, furniture, clothing, even parts of their homes in a desperate attempt to keep warm. In some cases, people huddled together for warmth, hoping to survive until help arrived. The storm also took a devastating toll on livestock and agriculture. In rural Iran, where many communities depended on farming for survival, entire herds of sheep and cattle perished in the cold. The loss of so many animals meant that even after the snow melted, food shortages would continue for months. Farmers who had already suffered through the years of drought now faced yet another catastrophe, as the weight of the snow destroyed storage buildings, crushing what little grain and supplies they had left. Efforts to deliver aid were met with significant challenges. Helicopters attempted to drop supplies into snow-covered regions, but high winds made flying dangerous. When pilots did manage to get close to affected areas, they found it nearly impossible to locate survivors. From above, many villages appeared as nothing more than smooth, unbroken fields of white, with no sign of life beneath. In some cases, rescue teams only realized they had flown over a buried settlement when they saw small holes in the snow, desperate attempts by survivors to dig their way out. As the storm dragged on, temperatures continued to drop. In some of the hardest hit regions, thermometers registered temperatures as low as -25 degrees Celsius. For those still trapped beneath the snow, the chances of survival were dwindling by the hour. The Iranian government declared a national emergency, but even with international offers of assistance, getting help to those in need remained nearly impossible. The full extent of the disaster was still unknown, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was no ordinary blizzard. This was a natural disaster of historic proportions, one that would leave a lasting impact on Iran for years to come. As the blizzard raged on, the full scale of the disaster became more apparent. The relentless snowfall showed no signs of stopping, and the freezing temperatures made any attempts at rescue increasingly difficult. In the hardest hit areas, people were running out of options. With food supplies gone and no access to clean water, survival became a battle against time. In villages that had not been completely buried, those who could still move attempted to dig tunnels through the snow in search of supplies or help. But the sheer depth of the snowfall, reaching over 25 feet in some places, made these efforts nearly impossible. Many who ventured out never returned, either lost in the blinding snow or overcome by exhaustion and the cold. Emergency responders worked tirelessly, but their efforts were severely limited. Helicopters attempted to fly over buried villages to drop supplies, but strong winds and heavy snowfall made navigation dangerous. Some pilots reported flying over areas that should have been populated, only to see nothing but vast expanses of white. With entire communities erased from sight, the challenge was not just delivering aid, it was finding the people who needed it. In some cases, desperate survivors attempted to signal for help. Those who still had access to rooftops climbed onto them, waving sheets or anything brightly colored in hopes of being spotted. Others burned whatever they could to create smoke signals. But with visibility near zero for much of the storm, many of these efforts went unnoticed. The human toll was devastating, but the impact of the storm extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. In major cities like Tehran, daily life had come to a complete halt. Roads were blocked, businesses were shuttered, and transportation was paralyzed. The closure of Iran's main airport meant that even international aid struggled to arrive in a timely manner. Supplies were running low, and the sense of isolation only added to the fear gripping the nation. Outside the cities, medical crises worsened. Those who had been injured in avalanches or collapsed homes had no way to reach hospitals. And with many doctors trapped by the snow themselves, medical care was nearly non-existent. The flu epidemic that had already begun spreading before the blizzard only made matters worse, as weakened immune systems struggled against the freezing temperatures. In many cases, people who had survived the initial impact of the storm succumbed days later due to exposure, starvation, or untreated illnesses. The Iranian military was eventually called in to assist, but even their resources were stretched thin. Soldiers fought their way through snow-covered roads, using whatever equipment they had to clear pathways and search for survivors. Some towns received much-needed provisions, but for many areas, it was too little, too late. The sheer magnitude of the disaster had overwhelmed the country's ability to respond. Despite the tragedy, stories of resilience emerged. In some villages, neighbors worked together to keep each other alive, pooling resources and taking turns digging through the snow in search of food. In Tehran, volunteers braved the elements to bring supplies to those who were stranded. People who had lost everything found comfort in the kindness of strangers, proving that even in the face of one of the worst blizzards in history, the human spirit remained unbroken. As the storm finally began to subside, rescue workers prepared to assess the true scale of the devastation. But what they would uncover in the days that followed would shock the world and cement the 1972 Iran blizzard as one of the deadliest snowstorms in recorded history. As the blizzard finally loosened its grip on Iran, the nation was left in a state of shock. The skies cleared, and for the first time in over a week, sunlight revealed the full scale of destruction. Entire villages had been wiped off the map, buried under towering snowdrifts. Roads and railways, once the lifelines of transportation, were unrecognizable. It was a disaster unlike anything the country had ever experienced. Rescue teams and volunteers moved quickly, working through the frozen landscape to search for any remaining survivors. In some places, people were found clinging to life inside their homes, having survived on melting snow and whatever food they had managed to save before the storm. But in far too many villages, the news was grim. As workers dug into the thick snow, they uncovered frozen bodies, entire families who had perished together, unable to escape the relentless cold. One of the hardest hit regions was the village of Sheklab. Rescuers who finally arrived found no signs of life. Out of its 100 residents, not a single person had survived. This was a devastating pattern across western Iran, where an estimated 200 villages were erased, their populations lost beneath the snow. Some settlements were so completely buried that they were never rebuilt. The government, heavily criticized for its slow response during the blizzard, ramped up its recovery efforts. Helicopters dropped supplies to isolated areas, and teams worked around the clock to clear roads and restore electricity. International aid began to arrive with supplies and financial assistance from various countries. However, the scale of the disaster was so immense that relief efforts could not keep up with the level of devastation. Many families who had lost their homes were forced to take shelter in makeshift camps, relying on aid for survival. As days turned into weeks, the melting snow revealed the true extent of the damage. Homes and buildings that had withstood the weight of the snow were now at risk of collapse due to water damage. Farmland was destroyed, adding to the hardship for those who relied on agriculture for their livelihood. The economic toll on Iran was severe, as trade and transportation had been halted for an extended period. In rural areas, the loss of entire communities meant that reconstruction would take years, if not decades. Beyond the physical destruction, the emotional and psychological impact of the blizzard lingered. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, and survivors carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. For those who had been trapped for days, the feeling of helplessness and fear was something they would never forget. In the years that followed, the Iran blizzard of 1972 was studied by meteorologists and disaster response experts. Scientists examined how a storm of such magnitude had developed so suddenly, while government officials looked at how future disasters could be handled more effectively. The blizzard became a harsh lesson in the importance of preparedness, leading to improvements in Iran's emergency response systems. Decades later, the memory of the storm still lingers. It remains the deadliest blizzard in recorded history, a tragedy that claimed over 4,000 lives and changed the course of many more. Even today, older generations in Iran remember the fear and devastation it brought, passing down stories of survival and loss to younger generations. The villages that disappeared beneath the snow serve as a reminder of nature's immense power and the fragility of human life in the face of such force. Though time has moved forward, the legacy of the 1972 Iran blizzard remains. It was a disaster that reshaped communities, tested the resilience of a nation, and left behind a stark warning of how quickly nature can turn deadly.